Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that hits home for pretty much everyone, and it's complex.
Yeah, how do we even begin to understand how the things we do, how our identities, our desires?
Right. All of that bumping up against what society tells us is normal or acceptable.
It's huge, right? We're talking about self-understanding how we fit in or don't in the world around us.
Absolutely. And to guide us through this maze, we're turning to two giants of feminist thought.
Oh, yeah. Gotta bring out the big guns for this one.
You know them. Julia Kristeva and Judith Butler. You were sharing some excerpts from Butler's Gender Trouble, her critique of Kristeva, and well, that's exactly what we're diving in today.
Sounds good. Kristeva's a perfect starting point. She really digs into the power of language. I mean, how it shapes our very sense of self.
Okay, so we're not just talking about words on a page.
Yeah.
More like how language, like the actual sounds, rhythms, even bodily expressions, all tie into this idea of self.
You got it. It's not just about the dictionary definitions, right? It's deeper than that. Kristeva calls this the semiotic, those instinctual pre-cultural aspects of language. Like, think about those first sounds a baby makes.
Or even like the nonsensical stuff that can come out when someone's experiencing psychosis.
Exactly. Those are expressions of the semiotic, these raw, unfiltered impulses coming straight from the maternal body.
Okay. So if the semiotic is this primal, almost pre-verbal form of expression, where does that leave like our conscious understanding of ourselves in the world?
Well, that's where the symbolic comes in. See, Kristeva contrasts the semiotic with the symbolic, which is all about structure and order.
The rules, the grammar, those categories we use to make sense of the world.
Yeah, and let's be honest, it's pretty paternal too, right?
So it's like this constant battle, the semiotic, this untamed energy always bubbling up, trying to disrupt the order of the symbolic.
You could say that. Kristeva argues certain bodily acts can really shake up that symbolic order.
Oh, interesting. Like what kind of acts are we talking about?
She points to childbirth, poetic language, even female homosexuality as examples.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. Each of those challenges societal norms in their own way.
Totally. They often mess with traditional ideas about gender and sexuality, disrupt those expectations.
Like childbirth, for example. It's this incredibly primal experience, but so loaded with cultural meanings and baggage.
Exactly. And Kristeva says these acts, while potentially subversive, they don't completely escape the symbolic order.
So they shake things up, but don't fully overthrow the system.
That's the idea. It's almost like a melancholic compromise, right? Like they offer a glimpse of something beyond the symbolic, but can't quite break free.
And this is where Judith Butler enters the picture with her critique of Kristeva.
Right. Buckle up, because things are about to get even more interesting.
So hit me with it. What are Butler's main issues with Kristeva's theory?
Well, she challenges a few key things. First off, this idea of a purely natural maternal body.
So even something as seemingly fundamental as motherhood isn't immune to the influence of the symbolic.
Nope. Butler says even our understanding of the body is shaped by those cultural norms and expectations.
Makes you think. Then there's the whole drive theory thing, right?
Oh, yeah. Butler takes issue with that, too. She sees it as too essentialist, too deterministic.
I'm not sure I follow. Could you break that down a bit? What does she mean by essentialist here?
Basically, Butler says that Kristeva, by focusing so much on drives and instincts, misses how much our desires and identities are molded by social and cultural factors. It's not that those drives aren't real, but they're always interacting with language, culture, you name it.
Okay, starting to get the depth of Butler's argument here. She's not just disagreeing with Kristeva's conclusions, she's questioning the whole framework.
Exactly. And one of the most controversial parts of her critique is her take on Kristeva's lesbian psychosis idea.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how that could be a bit of a minefield. What's the gist of Butler's argument there?
So Kristeva suggests lesbianism is like a psychotic break from the symbolic order, but Butler pushes back hard on that. She says framing it that way actually pathologizes lesbianism.
Instead of seeing it as a potential challenge to the system, it ends up reinforcing the idea of lesbianism as deviant or disordered.
You got it. And Butler argues that Kristeva maybe unintentionally projects all these cultural anxieties about female sexuality onto lesbianism.
Wow. It makes you wonder how much of what we see as natural or inherent is really just cultural conditioning.
Totally, right. And this leads us to another fascinating example Butler uses, the case of Herculine Barbin.
Now that's a name I haven't heard before. Who was she and why is her story relevant here?
Herculine was a 19th century hermaphrodite and her life story. It was documented in journals that Michel Foucault later discovered and published. It gives us this incredible lens to look at the limits of those binary categories of sex and gender.
So her existence basically challenged the whole foundation of male and female.
Exactly. Her body, with its ambiguous sexual characteristics, totally defied easy categorization. It exposed the cracks in a system that insists on this clear-cut line between male and female.
I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for Herculin, especially back then.
Oh, absolutely. Her journals are full of the pressure she faced to conform to a male identity, pressure from doctors, from society. It's a heartbreaking example of what happens when we try to force people into boxes that don't fit their lived reality.
Makes you think about how much has changed and how much hasn't Foucault brought Herculin's story to light? But even his framing of it, maybe missed some of the nuances of her struggle.
That's a really good point. It's like Foucault almost romanticized Herculin's non-identity, celebrating this idea of her transgressing societal norms. But reading her own words, you feel the pain, the alienation of being forced to live in a system that offered no space for her to truly be herself.
Powerful stuff.
Oh.
It reminds us that even when we're trying to celebrate difference, we have to be careful not to erase the struggles of people who don't fit those neat societal categories.
Couldn't agree more. It highlights the need to move beyond simplistic narratives of liberation and recognize that it's messy. It's about individual experience, social structures, the power of language, all tangled up together, shaping how we see ourselves and the world around us.
So, if something as fundamental as biological sex isn't as straightforward as we think, where does that leave us with gender? Is it all just a social construct then?
That's a question that still sparks debate in feminist theory and beyond. It brings us to another layer of this discussion.
Yeah.
The whole master gene idea for sex determination.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that research. Didn't they claim to have found a gene that basically determines if someone develops as male?
Yeah, there was a lot of hype around that study from MIT. They said they pinpointed the gene that triggers male development. But like a lot of scientific discoveries, the reality turned out to be a lot more complicated.
Like what?
Well, for starters, this so-called male gene was found in females, too.
Wait, hold on. So if both sexes have it, how could it be the single thing that makes someone male?
That's one of the big criticisms, right? Plus, critics pointed out that the research mostly focused on male development, not so much on female pathways.
So basically, are we letting our own cultural ideas about gender bias, how we understand biological sex, even at the scientific level?
It's a valid concern. It seems even in science, our understanding of sex and gender can be influenced by those pre-existing cultural narratives.
So if this master gene idea is too simplistic, how do we make sense of all this? Is gender entirely a social construct then?
To tackle that, we need to bring another voice into the mix. Monique Wittig, a radical feminist theorist with a really provocative take on the whole sex and gender relationship.
Okay, things just got real.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard Wittig's work is both brilliant and controversial. What makes her perspective so unique?
Well, Wittig goes further than most in challenging the very idea of a sex-gender distinction. She rejects the notion that gender is just a social layer on top of biological sex. Instead, she says both sex and gender are products of this specific social and historical context, which she calls the heterosexual contract.
We've touched on the heterosexual contract before, but break it down for me. What does Wittig mean by that, and why is it so central to her argument?
Okay, so for Wittig, the heterosexual contract isn't just about sexual orientation. It's this bigger social agreement that shapes literally everything, how we understand the world, our language, our institutions, our relationships, even our own bodies.
So it's like this invisible rule book telling us how to live, love, even understand ourselves.
You got it. And at the heart of this contract, according to Wittig, is this idea of a fundamental difference between men and women.
Which is then used to justify all sorts of power imbalances and hierarchy.
Exactly. And for Wittig, this contract is oppressive, especially for women and LGBTQ plus folks. It limits our choices, our freedom, our ability to truly express ourselves.
So she's calling for a radical rethinking, not just of gender, but of the systems that shape our society as a whole.
She is. And her most provocative statement, one that's caused a lot of debate, is her claim that lesbians are not women.
Okay, whoa. We're going to need to unpack that one.
Mm-hmm.
What does she mean by that, and how does it fit into her critique of the heterosexual contract?
That, my friend, is a conversation for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so let's dive into that statement. Lesbians are not women. It's definitely a head-scratcher at first.
Right. It's meant to be provocative, but there's a lot of thought behind it. Wittig's argument is that the whole category of woman, it only exists in relation to man.
So it's all tied up in that heterosexual contract we were talking about.
Exactly. It's about assuming a specific role in a system built on binary opposition and male dominance.
So by choosing to exist outside of that framework, lesbians are rejecting that category altogether.
You got it. It's not about denying biology. She's saying the category woman itself is constructed in a way that reinforces those power structures of heterosexuality.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
It makes you question everything we think we know about gender and sexuality.
It definitely challenges us to rethink those assumptions, right? And Wittig's work has been really influential in all these current debates about gender identity and fluidity of expression.
It makes you wonder, if we let go of these rigid categories of man and woman, what other possibilities for self-definition could open up?
That's the exciting part. Wittig's not just critiquing the system, she's pointing towards a world where we can embrace the full spectrum of human experience without being boxed in by these limited categories.
But to even start challenging these deeply ingrained categories,
Yeah.
we need to understand how language keeps them in place. Wittig has some strong opinions about that too, right?
Yeah. She calls language a war machine.
A war machine. That's intense.
It is. It emphasizes how language can be used to both oppress and liberate. She sees it as the primary tool for enforcing the heterosexual contract, shaping our thoughts, beliefs, even our desires.
Can you give me some concrete examples of how language functions as this war machine when it comes to gender and sexuality?
Think about all the words and phrases we use to police gender norms.
Yeah.
Like calling a boy a sissy or a girl a tomboy just because they don't fit those narrow expectations.
Or even the way language is used to objectify and dehumanize women, reducing them to their bodies or their relationship to men.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's everywhere. And for Wittig, challenging the heterosexual contract means challenging the very language that upholds it.
So what's the solution? Do we create new words, reclaim old ones? Or is it something else entirely?
It's a combination of approaches, really, and it's happening all around us. Think about how language is evolving to include terms like non-binary or genderqueer. That's expanding the vocabulary to reflect a more nuanced understanding of gender.
It's like we're rewriting the dictionary in real time.
We are. But it's not just about adding new words. It's about questioning the assumptions embedded in the language we already use. Like, why are certain professions or activities seen as inherently masculine or feminine?
So it's about being more mindful of the language we use, recognizing its power, and using it to create more inclusive spaces.
Exactly. And for Wittig, this idea of linguistic resistance is closely tied to her vision of lesbian existence as a revolutionary act.
Okay, let's circle back to that. How does Wittig see lesbianism as a challenge to the heterosexual contract?
For her, it's a refusal to participate in that system of compulsory heterosexuality that defines the contract. It's about creating relationships, communities, ways of being that exist outside of that dominant paradigm.
So it's not just about who you love.
Yeah.
It's a much deeper rejection of the power structures that shape our entire society.
You got it. And that rejection has the potential to disrupt not only gender norms, but other forms of social hierarchy and oppression as well.
It's about envisioning a world where we're not limited by these predetermined scripts, where our identities and desires can unfold in all their complexity and beauty.
And while Wittig's vision might seem idealistic, it's important to remember that every social movement, every shift in consciousness starts with someone daring to imagine a different reality.
It's like planting a seed, right?
Right.
Nurturing it with critical thought and creativity and watching it grow into something transformative.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that core question: how does language both limit and expand our sense of self?
We've seen how it can be used to enforce rigid categories and uphold oppressive systems, but also how it can challenge those systems, create new ways of understanding each other, and imagine a world where difference is celebrated, not feared.
It seems like the key is becoming aware of those power dynamics embedded in language, questioning them, and using language in creative, conscious ways to build a more just and liberatory world.
It's a big challenge, but definitely a worthwhile one. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear from you, the listener. What's resonating with you? What new insights or questions have come up for you as we've explored these complex ideas?
And how do you see language playing a role in shaping your own sense of self, your relationships, and your place in the world?
Wow. We've covered so much ground today, delving into all these ideas about how our bodies, identities, and desires can challenge what society considers normal.
And how language is this powerful force shaping those norms, but also giving us a way to push back against them.
For sure. I think what struck me most is how, Even categories we think of as fundamental, like man and woman, they're not as fixed and absolute as we might believe.
Right. It's easy to forget that, remember Kristeva's semiotic, those raw pre-cultural expressions constantly challenging the neat order of the symbolic.
Like a reminder that there's always something pushing against those constraints of language and categorization.
Exactly. And then Butler comes in and takes the critique even further, questioning the idea of a natural, essential maternal body.
And the whole drive theory thing, too.
Yeah, she's pointing out that even our understanding of the body itself is shaped by cultural norms and expectations. It's not that those drives and instincts don't exist, but they're always being filtered through language and culture.
It's like this constant balancing act between our individual experiences and those societal pressures to conform.
Totally. And that tension is so clear in Herculine Barbin's story. Her life, as she documented it in her journals, it really highlights the consequences of trying to force people into rigid categories that just don't fit their reality.
It's heartbreaking, and it makes you question whether those categories are even helpful for those who do seem to fit within them. You know, are we all missing out on possibilities because we're so attached to these predetermined roles?
That's a great question to consider. It's like we're all actors in a play that was written way before we were even born.
And Butler would say we have the power to rewrite the script, to challenge those expectations and create new roles for ourselves.
Exactly. Remember, she sees gender as a performance right. This series of actions and expressions we repeat until they become so ingrained they seem natural and inevitable.
But if it's a performance, we can always choose to perform it differently.
Exactly. We can improvise, subvert expectations, create entirely new characters. And Wittig takes that idea even further, arguing that we need to dismantle the whole stage itself, the stage she calls the heterosexual contract.
And that's where things get really radical. Her work challenges us to see how this unspoken agreement, with its emphasis on binary opposition and male dominance, it shapes how we understand everything, our bodies, relationships, the whole shebang.
Right. And she argues that man and woman, these categories themselves are products of this contract. So by stepping outside of it, we open up all these new possibilities for self-definition and liberation.
Her statement, lesbians are not women, it really hits home that point. It's not about denying biology, but rejecting those limitations inherent in the category of woman as it's defined within this contract.
It's about refusing to play by the rules of a game that's rigged against you. It's about creating a whole new game.
And for Wittig, language is both the weapon and the tool for creating that new reality. Remember, she calls language a war machine. It can be used to enforce oppressive norms, but also to challenge them and create new possibilities for expressing who we are.
And that brings us back to the power of awareness. Paying attention to the words we use, the assumptions we make, recognizing how those societal norms might be limiting our own potential.
It's about questioning everything, challenging those deeply held beliefs, and being open to new ways of understanding ourselves in the world.
And don't be afraid to experiment. Play with those gender norms, challenge those expectations. Find ways to express yourself authentically, even if it feels a little uncomfortable at first.
It's about embracing the fact that human experience is fluid and complex. We're all constantly evolving, redefining ourselves.
And you're not alone in this journey. There's a whole community of people out there questioning those limitations, challenging those norms, and creating new possibilities for what it means to be human.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this question. What will you choose to create? What new narratives will you write? What boundaries will you push? And what kind of world will you help build?
The power is in your hands and the possibilities are endless. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
And that's a wrap for this deep dive. See you next time.